My name is Jack Thorne. For over 3 years, I've been running from the SCP Foundation. This is my story. Sam sat opposite me at the tiny airport restaurant table, smirking. "Are you really going to waste those?" She referred to the half-eaten stack of pancakes directly in front of me. I'd been feeling sick all week. I didn't even have much of an appetite. "If you're not going to eat them, ditch them. We've got to go." I looked at my watch. "Oh shit," I replied. I groaned as I stood up, holding my chest. I had no idea what was wrong, but I knew I had to get to my gate before my flight left without me. Sam and I hustled down the brightly lit terminal, the sound of board PA announcements filling the air. "I hate flying," Sam muttered when we reached and joined the long queue waiting to board the flight. "Especially when I'm flying for a stupid person." I groaned as I rummaged through my pockets for our tickets. "Frank is an expert in finding places to live for people like us," I whispered over the hum of conversation around us. "If he's such an expert, why didn't you turn to him before now?" Sam asked. "Things are more complicated now," I said gruffly, regretting what I'd said almost immediately. "I can take care of myself," Sam replied before passing her ticket to a middle-aged woman in heavy makeup who scanned her ticket without even glancing at it. "Welcome aboard," she muttered before reaching past Sam for my ticket, seemingly eager to cram the human cargo onto the plane as quickly as possible. Before long, we were all on the plane, jammed against each other in seats that seemed designed for small children. Sam and I were crammed into a row alongside a large man holding a hamburger that he munched on noisily behind us, burping and smacking his lips with each bite. This man was sat in the window seat, with Sam in the middle and me against the window. Sam did everything that she could to avoid physical contact with the man, but her efforts were in vain. I couldn't help but laugh watching her work so hard to avoid touching this aggressively sweating man. Her dismay only grew as the plane taxied down the runway and finally took off, rocketing into the clouds. After a few minutes, the fasten seatbelt sign turned off, and Sam was free to push her way past the man and take a walk down the plane, with the excuse of needing the bathroom. She wasn't gone long before she ran back, her face pale. "Something's wrong," she said. Almost immediately, the lights got out. I pushed past the now sleeping man and looked around. All lights had been cut. I glanced down the cabin to see a very confused air hostess trying all of the switches before attempting to make an announcement in the PA system, which was also down. The plane itself seemed unaffected. We were still maintaining altitude through the clouds. The only change, besides the lights, being the growing irritability of the board passengers who now couldn't watch The Avengers on their setback TV screens. "What's going on here?" one man called out, huffing angrily and rubbing his head. "I'll go check it out," I said, then walked to the bathroom, pulling Sam along by her arm. "How did you know something was wrong?" I asked. "Did you foresee something?" She didn't answer. Instead, she just turned her eyes, nodding in the direction of the bathroom power outlet. There, a tiny blue spark was visibly emerging from the socket and was growing quickly. The spark quickly grew into a collection of sparks, each dancing around a cluster that shone brightly and emanated a faint humming sound. "How's that heartburn doing?" Sam asked. I hadn't really given it much thought since taking a seat in the plane, but now that she mentioned it, I did feel better. "I'm fine," I replied, wondering why she'd asked. "We've got to hide," Sam whispered, grabbing my hand and pulling me furiously as she sprinted down the aisle. Suddenly, the bathroom behind us exploded in an eruption of blue sparks and static electricity. The air surged with static as a small figure made entirely of blue electrical sparks floated out of the stall. The already scared group of passengers began to scream and clamor to take off their seatbelts as the figure emerged. Sam and I raced into the airplane galley, crouching behind a drink cart. Sam began babbling, her eyes darting left and right. "He's here for us. I think you carried him here. He's going to feed off the plane's power while tearing it apart looking for us." "You're not making sense," I replied, grabbing both of her hands in an attempt to calm her down. "He destroys one of the plane doors. The plane is going down," she said, her eyes wide. "Wait here," I said, then crept into the edge of the galley. I looked around and saw what was now an almost 6-foot-tall humanoid made entirely out of electricity floating down the aisle. Except for the light emanating from the humanoid, the cabin was entirely dark. The noise of screaming people had entirely disappeared. And now I know why. It looked as though everyone was unconscious, and with the air so thick with static electricity, it seemed as though this thing was drinking power from every source available, including the passengers. "Hey!" I called out, immediately attracting the humanoid's attention. It didn't speak, Instead, it raised its right hand and sent out a blast of lightning that hurtled in my direction. I jumped into a nearby unoccupied chair, the bolt of lightning clipping my arm, searing through my bicep. I held my arm as the pain resonated throughout my body. I could see I had sustained a pretty severe burn. The humanoid floated towards me. I stood and ran up the aisle, sprinting towards the front when another lightning blast exploded in front of me, pushing me through the air and slamming me against a small door near the bathroom. Thinking it was the bathroom, I opened it to reveal a thin ladder, but before I could go down, I felt my neck searing with an unimaginable heat. I turned around to see the humanoid standing right beside me. He was holding my neck with a vice-like grip. He then lifted me off the ground by my neck, holding me in the air. Looking down at his brightly shining form, I swear I could faintly see a face staring angrily back at me as he choked the life out of me. I couldn't help but think that this was a pretty spectacular way to die. Just as my vision had almost reduced to nothing, the direct cart hurtled down the aisle and slammed into the electrical humanoid. Upon impact, sparks burst everywhere, dancing over the heads of the people sleeping as their electrical energy was slowly siphoned. The humanoid let out a deep metallic screech before throwing me over the chairs and into the emergency door. I laid on the floor, gasping for air, then looked around the cabin. It was entirely dark. I stood up shakily, then looked across the cabin. The small door was hanging open, and a slight glow was emanating from below. I started walking towards the cockpit, but immediately spun around when I heard a scream from the ladder's direction. I ran over and jumped down, almost knocking into Sam.
"You idiot,"
she screamed.
"Get back up."
I was standing in the luggage compartment where Sam had lured the humanoid and was now hampering her escape. "You go first," I shouted as the humanoid rushed towards us. "Tell the captain to lower the altitude of the plane before opening the luggage compartment door."
"Will do,"
she shouted before climbing into the cabin.
"You coming?"
she asked. "Tell the captain to be fast," I replied, then shut the door. Immediately I felt the humanoid holding my neck once again, but this time I grabbed its shoulders and pushed it back. Touching the humanoid burned my skin, but it was solid enough to touch without my hand going right through. Encouraged, I crunched my burned hand into a fist and punched it in the face, sending sparks flying throughout the luggage. The creature let out another resounding screech before falling back towards the door. It then ran at me, but I ran back with my shoulder down, tackling it and pinning it against the door, punching it once again with my red raw fist. A second later, an alarm sounded, and a red light flashed. The door began opening, and I could see grassy hills racing by a few hundred feet beneath us. Holding the humanoid around its waist, I threw my weight backward, pulling us both out of the plane and into the roaring wind. The humanoid tried to grab the door, instead bending it out of shape before losing its grip and hurtling outside. Sparks flew everywhere, crackling bolts of electricity flying in all directions. The humanoid started flailing, its body being pulled apart by the pressure. With nothing to hold on to, it clung to me. In that second, I looked back into the creature's face, where I saw fear, before I melted myself into the shadow being cast by the plane against the grassy hills below. Now unrestrained, the humanoid let out one last screech before disappearing into the cool evening air. Now depressurized, the plane began falling out of the sky. It tossed in the wind, unable to control itself with the lost pressure. The luggage cabin door couldn't close, having been bent out of shape, so there was no way to avoid the plane colliding with the oncoming ground. I spread myself across the shadow I was now in control of and positioned myself beneath the plane. Then, as the plane made contact with my shadow, I absorbed it into myself, softening the plane's landing as though the plane were landing onto a giant fast-moving hand instead of the unforgiving ground. Once I got hold of the plane, I slowly decelerated, bringing the plane to a gentle stop. Once the plane had completely stopped moving, it sat, half melted into the ground, smoke pouring from every engine, and materialized beside the plane when a small hatch opened beneath the cockpit, and Sam jumped out.
"Thanks, boys,"
she yelled, waving at the two confused pilots staring blankly back at her.
"Well, this is a fine mess,"
she said casually as we both stared at the destroyed plane in front of us. "We'd probably better get out of here," I said as the sound of sirens filled the air.
"Fancy pancakes?"
she said, one eyebrow raised. "You know, I'm actually hungry right now," I said, flashing a grin. "I'd love some pancakes."